Well, here we are, another episode, Renee. Welcome. What are we talking about today?
Oh man, we were still working on this substance use series. I think it's the longest series we've done podcasting. And we're talking today about psychedelics and talking about the use of cannabis, and some of the psychotic features that can come with the use of cannabis that we don't always talk about. And then we're going to talk about vaping and whether or not vaping is safer, because a lot of times people think because it's not tobacco and it's not a cigarette, it's safer, but we know all of these things can get mixed together and make it really a complicated conversation. But before we dive into this story, Jason, what is going on the farm? What's happening?
Well, I've been doing a lot of, we've been working, but there's been some recreational stuff going on too. My son bought an excavator. So I've been able to dig some holes. And so there's nothing more fun than just hanging out on the farm and digging just because you can dig, Renee. And so that's kind of been the recreation because everyone needs an excavator, right?
Okay, but what do you put in the holes? Anything, or you're just putting making holes to make holes?
Well, no, we're trying to unearth there's some clay tile that go down to something we don't know what, and that's in the pathway of where the semis need to pull in to unload the new bin. And so we actually
Wow.
have to dig it up to make sure there's not something that may collapse underneath. So we don't know if it's an old well or exactly what's there. So we actually are digging with purpose, but it's kind of a recreational dig, if you know what I'm. So we'll see if we unearth anything exciting and we'll report that back.
That always sounds like when you talk about moving rocks and you make your rock piles. It sounds like you're picking stuff up, moving it around just because it sounds like fun and stuff shows up in your fields. So I guess that makes some sense. But no, I can't say everybody needs an excavator. Can't say
Um,
so.
Well,
But
everyone needs to know somebody that has an excavator that you can borrow. Like I wouldn't advocate you definitely need your own, but if you know somebody,
yeah,
then there is nothing more fun than playing around in an excavator all day. It's got a stereo, like you can crank up the tunes,
there you go. Now you're
heat, air
talking.
conditioning. You can do it, whatever. It's like, anytime. It could be raining, turn the windshield wipers on. It's great, Renee. So there's your activity. That's my farmer tip of the day. Just go out in the excavator and just relax and don't think about the yield. Don't think about the price of crops. Don't think about any of the things that are stressful. Just do something mind numbing and fun and enjoy yourself.
All right, I got it. I don't think my HOA would appreciate any of that. I'd be in big trouble,
I'll
but hey,
drop it off. I'll drop it off for you for the weekend. You can see what the HOA. You're the
yeah,
president. What you can do whatever you want at the
just
HOA.
park it right outside in the extra parking and let's see what kind of conversation starts next. That'd be so dang funny. All
That's a
right.
great intro into this
It really
episode
is.
of
It really is.
vaping and cannabis, right?
And
Let's
gummies
go.
and the whole thing. I know. So let's start off, Jason. Let's talk about vaping. I mean, this is a new thing. What is it? What does it mean to be when someone vapes? And talk about what's in it. And then let's talk about what they're starting to find because it really is new. So some people are like, "Oh, it's safer." But that's because it hasn't been around very long to look at some research. But now we're starting to get some research. So what is it? And kind of tell us all about it.
Well, and vaping really isn't new, right? It's just a new means
True.
of consuming, right? So, we've had smoking for many, many, many years. And, I remember the first smoking bans, when we talk about nicotine, and so really vaping, electronic cigarettes are just the delivery device for a substance, right? And so lots of different substances can be introduced into a vaping device. And I think sometimes older folks don't quite understand what all the different substances are and how easily they can be delivered through these devices. And really,
Right.
it's really hard to identify and sense some of these devices because
Right.
they're much more easily hidden. I remember the first smoking bans in Ames
Mhm.
back in the day, and it was great to go out to restaurants again because you didn't smell secondhand smoke all over the place. And so, I've always been kind of an anti-smoking guy just because I don't enjoy smelling other people smoke all the time. The one of the benefits of why it was sold kind of to everyone was vaping doesn't intrude upon people around you, and so that was one of the selling points. And so that's kind of where vaping was
Right.
introduced as smoking bans and as the delivery of using cigarettes became less and less, opportunistic as more laws came up against it. The big tobacco companies got really smart and said, well, we're going to introduce something safer.
Right. Well, what's really scary about that, I too am a fan of the Smoke-Free Air Act and in Iowa not having smoke in restaurants. And I often forget when I go traveling outside of Iowa that it's not everywhere. And I know you and I have
Right.
run into that ourselves where
Mhm.
we end up at a restaurant, maybe working and find a restaurant to eat. And it's like, oh man, forgot. And it does give you more opportunities in the state. I was always allergic to cigarette smoke, which was one of the reasons I didn't smoke, which I'm very grateful for that reason because I probably would have done really stupid things because I made bad choices
Mhm.
growing up. But I was really allergic, and so I wasn't tempted by any of that. But when you start talking about vaping, what they're starting to see is that vaping can cause inflammation in the lungs and are causing some holes in the lungs. And they don't totally know everything that the reaction. So we had all that research for smoking and secondhand smoke for years
Right.
and years and years from cigarettes. But then once they started flipping it over to vaping, everybody was like, it's safer, like you said. But when you start seeing now some of the repercussions and what's the juice in the vaping is so widely varied. I think that's the big thing. It's everything from like, kind of a flavored scent of something to could be any kind of the substances that we are talking about today could be included. And so if you're not careful and not reading your labels, and maybe there aren't even labels, you don't know exactly what you're putting into your lungs. And that's where
So
it gets scary.
thinking about who this is marketing to, in 2024, what are the top five flavors? Renee, go ahead and take a guess as to the number one best-selling vape flavor.
Ugh, this all sounds terrible. Cherry?
No,
Cotton candy?
cherry does not. Cherry pomegranate made number four.
All right, so there's a cherry. How about cotton candy or something weird like that? Or bubble
No,
gum?
so oh, see you went so
I
the
went
list I'm
sweet.
looking at from Vape Cloud
Oh,
says the number one flavor was grape, number two
great.
blueberry raspberry, number three was strawberry watermelon, and then we talked about number four cherry pomegranate, and number five strawberry kiwi fruit.
All
So
right.
they
Well,
went
all of
with
those
the
can be
fruity
cotton candy
flavors,
flavors. So
right?
they
So they
still
could
kind of, and bubblegum flavors. So it's kind of the same, just not okay. So fruity flavors are basically the thing that's in.
right.
Okay. Well, isn't that just like us to make something fruity to hide a substance that's not good for us? We do that in alcohol beverages too. So, how fruity can you make? Like, for example, I mean, I know you're a coffee person, nothing against coffee, but I don't like it. But when I started people trying to get me to drink it, you put all the fruity stuff in it to try to mask the flavor of the coffee. I could still taste the coffee at the bottom. And then I realized how many calories of other stuff I was going to be drinking just to try to mask the coffee it's really not to my best interest. So I'm like, yeah, it's not really for me. And so it's the same kind of thing when you're people that are really masking the flavors of alcohol and they don't really like the taste of different things. And so you're just masking flavors. But the flavoring itself has a lot of weird ingredients. And so what's interesting to me is how many people in the world right now are into this organic phase, right? Wanting to know all the foods, giving farmers all kinds of crap about how you raise your animals or how you raise your crops and whether or not they're organic or, GMO and all this garbage, right? And then yet we're putting things like vaping in our system at the same time with random preservatives, random flavors, random chemicals of all kinds and that's cool. And so it's really kind of weird because we put weird chemicals in our body in lots of different ways. So this is just one tool. But in addition to that, in the vaping products, oftentimes the nicotine's now in there. It's the same substances that cause trouble with tobacco back in the day. And then you can add additional things to it. So they talk about adding things like propylene, glycol, and glycerin to create the vapor. And so there's like some different types of things that you're doing to make those. And so what they're figuring out though is that even though you don't have the cigarette smoke, it still can cause cancer because the problematic ingredients are now vaped in that pen or the device rather than smoking it through a cigarette. And so it's not necessarily safer. And I know it was marketed that way, but it's really not. And so we're starting to see they call it popcorn lung and different things where you see holes in people's lungs and your lungs don't necessarily grow back from doing some of these things. And it's really kind of scary what we're doing with ourselves. But so let's talk about the psychedelic sides of this. So yes, you can have these regular vape pens like the regulars, but then you start adding maybe psychedelics or other cannabis and other things into them. And then what kind of issues happen? So I know we have some data talking about that. So let's walk into thinking about the psychedelics and the cannabis. How is that in there? Because I know with marijuana, right? Well, then we can get a component of getting high on top of it. So you have which is eventually, to me, is very interesting You have nicotine, which speeds you up, and marijuana that calms you down in the same product. That would make my body feel terrible. My body has a hard enough time doing one thing at once, let alone two. So
Right.
what are some of the data when
Well,
you start thinking about the psychedelic
I
component?
mean, let's think about it. We do Red Bull
I don't
shot, right?
know. Right.
And
Right.
so, you mix Red Bull with alcohol. So I mean, that's part
That's
of
true. You're putting caffeine in
culturally,
the
right, and
depressant.
depressant. So,
Wow.
that's
Okay.
pretty
Yeah.
common that we're doing things like
That's
that,
true. Okay.
mixing mixing different drugs for different
Yep.
effects, and I think, as we think about how efficient the delivery is directly to the lungs, so it's much more easily absorbed as we look at others, as we introduce more and more substances that are more and more, have higher. I I can't even talk this morning, Renee.
Think of it
As
like higher effects and just greater
yes,
levels of chemicals that are causing greater effects and greater challenges for
absolutely.
people. And so you're right, though. I don't know because people that may take them differently. Well, you think about drugs, say like a methamphetamine or whatever, and taking it orally versus intravenously, right? And the effects are different because you get to the bloodstream faster one way than the other. Same situation here. The lungs are just one big, you know, skin product to not call it
Mhm.
correctly at all because I'm terrible at this. But basically it's just an absorption, right? And it goes straight through to into your lungs, into your bloodstream because there's lots and lots of blood vessels all the way to the ends of your lobes of your lungs. And so
Mhm.
it's just a very quick way to absorb, like you're saying.
Well, right. And there is some use of this medicinally, and so I think about medic that there is a movement that there are some forms of epilepsy, other types of conditions that sometimes that this is beneficial for. And so, I think that's part of, I know at a federal level right now, there's still some struggle as to how we're going to identify marijuana. How is that going to be listed as a medication? We know, right now it's probably going to be next year before a final decision is made on that. But that's a conversation that's been had every year for the last couple of years of about changing, which category that substance fits into, so that it can open it up. It also goes toward criminalization of how do we address that particular substance. So specifically around cannabis, it's important that we take into account all of these different types of treatments that have been somewhat, accepted over the course of the past several decades, and then continuing to have a conversation about how is it being abused, right? And who is it that's using? We're talking about data. Who's using these substances at the highest rate? It's
So,
kids, right? 18 to 24-year-olds. And so we
well,
see the
yeah.
highest use
Well, yeah. If those are the
amongst youth.
flavors that you're
Right.
marketing to, it's gonna be kids that are looking for that. And that's really scary because you get people addicted at a really young age. That's really scary. So I was thinking too about just the types of drugs. So cannabis is complicated because there's a THC component that gets people high, but there's a CBD component, the
Right.
cannabidiol, that is the medicinal part. And so again, some people that are trying to parse the line are like, hey, this is the medicinal side, it shouldn't get thrown out. And this other side, is, the part that's problematic. So we could separate the two chemicals. And I'm sure that's true about a lot of other products. And so they're trying to find this line. But when one of the conversations we've had Leslie Carpenter on our show before, and cannabis being something that's kind of that lower level entry point into other drugs, and people still see it kind of as a gateway drug in many cases. That if some people have reactions of psychosis the first few times they use cannabis, and then the psychotic features don't necessarily go away. And then I know we've talked about this on another podcast, but the doctors now are saying that some of these medications and some of these drugs are so high that you take one hit of it and then you may be put in a psychotic state, then you might not be able to come back from. And they're seeing almost like brain injury type experiences for people that don't heal necessarily, or they don't know if they're going to heal because they've seen it and it's a longer term long acting kind of response to using a drug. And they don't, again, some of these are brand new, so you don't know yet if they're able to come back and to heal or not. And that's really scary because this very different than the people that used to smoke cannabis in the 50s and 60s. It's just not the same. And so you've got people that are older thinking, hey, this should be safe. We should legalize this. again, truly, it is about what you said related to regulating it and stuff so that they can tax it and make money. And so states are passing this to make a lot of money. And
Hmm.
so it's about money in an industry. And so people are maybe not looking at it from the safety and health of people using it as just like alcohol, right? If anybody with their right mind would look at that with the number of people getting OWIs and dying from overdoses of alcohol alone, we would not be selling it at the rate in which we're selling it, but we do it for other reasons. We do it because one, people, they say freedom, they also say, choice of people, but it also is taxed at a very high level to make a lot of money for the government. And so it's considered a sin tax. And so when you think of those things, it gets really complicated. So Jason, is there some data you wanted to chat about regarding some of these particular products today?
Well, I think we've mentioned some things about who's primarily utilizing them, but overall, there isn't a lot of data about the long-term harms of these. So, we can talk about THC, we can talk about CBT, we can talk about the levels that we see today. We know there's increased psychosis of drug-induced psychosis from these things, but really a lot of this data is in its infancy. And so we see the negative side effects happening, but the data isn't there to really to prove that these things are safe, or disprove. Either way, more likely more negatives than there are positives,
Right.
when you step back and look at it. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have. And we'll link some of the stuff that we have. There's some great stuff on the FDA website. The National Institute of Health has some great information on this as well. But I think that's part of the challenge right now is the drug companies are really pushing these things, that they push the envelope ahead of where the science is,
Mhm.
because that's what sells. And then a lot of states jump on it, just like you said, for the tax revenue, because it fills a gap. And so that's not necessarily in the interest of public health, right? And so I think that's where this comes down again, just like we dealt with cigarettes in the 70s and 80s and the smoking bans, is now we're back to, what is really in the public health's best interest, and who is being targeted for these substances, who is getting addicted, and at what age are they getting addicted? Because when you get someone addicted in junior high or high school, then you have a lifelong addict who's going to buy your product. And at the end of the day, that's what a lot of these companies really want.
Right. And it is really sad. I was just thinking yesterday, I had a question in my office about something that you learned in psychology about right-brained and left-brained. And the research now is different, that it's not exactly what we were taught in high school. And they're like, oh, I was lied to in high school. Well, that's not really the case. Science changes. And so, like to your point about these products, they're new on the market. And so we don't know all the repercussions. And so they're falsely claiming, and cigarettes did this for years, right? It was safe and cool to smoke cigarettes. They did it in all the TV shows, all the movies, and
Mhm.
all the things. And then it still was years after we knew it caused cancer, that it was a long, long time, decades later, before they then removed it from shows on television, removed it from movies,
Mhm.
removed it, but it's still a thing. And so it's going to take years for the politics and the legal side of this to catch up. And in the
Mhm.
meantime, to your point, people are getting harmed. So the data is pretty light on what it is. But you can, to be fair, look at the individual qualities of what's in the vape that you're looking at to determine if it's safe. Nicotine, you know exactly what it does. You can look that up. So if you're looking at, okay, what's in a gummy, you can look it up. So you can go figure out like what is the CBD and what does it do, or the THC and how much what does it do. So you can get some information. So you're going to be, as a person, wanting to use these products, just to be mindful and be aware and not just take it at face value that it's safe, because there's a long way from safer to safe. And safer could be, 1% less cancer, and that's safer,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean you're, still don't have a really high chance of getting cancer later. And so thinking about this, so how it impacts workplaces, Jason, because I know again, our policies haven't caught up yet. So what do we think about when it impacts work? How should we as people of the workplace think about people maybe using vape products or using
Well,
any of these things?
yeah, this is always a great conversation, right? Because it always comes down to impairment, right? Is it a substance that causes impairment? And this has been a big conversation, a lot of HR conferences that we've been to, about how do I determine impairment? What level of impairment? I mean, caffeine's a drug, right? I
Right.
mean, so, I take a mocha with me, everywhere I go, it seems like sometimes. So, can I be impaired by caffeine? I can be, right? And so, it's looking at what is my role, what is my job, and how do we know that? And sometimes people could be under the influence of marijuana and use a vaping e-cigarette delivery device at work in order to do that. And so if I'm a forklift operator, that's probably problematic in the work that I do. But that can also be difficult to detect, right? Without regular testing, drug testing programs, it's a challenge. And so identifying that impairment has been a real challenge, and how to put that in policy and how to detect that can be very, very challenging sometimes.
Yeah. And I would imagine too, just even for like smoking policies, I believe on the state grounds, they consider using vapes in the same locations as you would cigarettes. I think those are considered the same. But if you're a person that vapes, I'm guessing it'd be easier for you to sneak that and nobody maybe
Yeah,
notice. And so, because it's not,
exactly.
like you said, a scent that your people are going to catch onto and smell. And even in the like the Iowa Capitol, I don't know if people know this, but this is a way back when story. But it went smoke free, but except for specific offices where the leadership smoked. And there were years in the
Right.
middle of going completely smoke free that the folks in the highest levels of leadership in the Senate, president, and the House where they were smokers. And so they kept their offices able to smoke. And so it was this gradual switchover. And I'm telling you, for folks that are, that maybe were smokers, I can go to restaurants in Iowa that I never would have been in the door
Hmm.
because I just wouldn't have been able to breathe. And so it's a really big deal for me. But now the vaping situation is very different. And so it's going to be really interesting. And again, even secondhand vape, they don't know
Hmm.
for sure that that doesn't cause harm to others. And so, yeah, they think it's safer because you don't have but you said they cleaned up the smell and the stuff that it was problematic to the neighbors around them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that breathing it in is safe for the other
Right.
people either. So that's going to be another thing that over the years, the science is going to have to bear out and determine whether or not we should have been secondhand vaping. And we don't know. And so it's just a lot to think about moving forward. So anything else you want to talk about this before I go into the
Well,
self-care
I
policy?
was going to throw out there, the federal discrimination laws that some of the
Mm,
states that have legalized marijuana are actually in conflict with federal law. And so that creates a
okay.
real problem in workplaces as well, because
Mm,
sometimes the workplace doesn't know which law they're supposed to follow, the federal guidance, or the state guidance, and that can cause a lot of wiggle room and opportunities for litigation of employees if the employer makes the wrong choice. So I
very good
think
point.
all of those things complicate the decision as to how do you go about enforcing some rules in your policies as an organization or as a workplace, because it's not clear. It's not a clean
Mm.
way to address.
Nope. And so this is one of those that we'll have to revisit in future years to see if we've made any progress on any laws or any clarity of what can happen in workplaces because and if the data is more clear because it's all going to be unfolding in front of us. We're all part of a big research project in this space of what could be the challenges of using these higher level of psychedelics and cannabis. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. For this week, we're going to talk about the recovering politician self-care policy of the week. Jason, before the time change, it gets dark in the morning. And when it's darker in the morning, it is so hard for me to want to get up and go exercise. And I do such a good job, especially in the summer, getting up early, getting out the door. I may still be up with the moon, but man, when it gets to in October, it is getting colder. It's cozy to not be up, and I just don't want to. So I have to think about how to change that and to get my brain ready. I know there's some really cool people have some lights or some alarm clocks that turn on light to like mimic like the sunrise and things. I don't know. We have to think about something because this time of year always gets hard. And then they have that time change that I still don't love. And then I'm always like a mess. My body just still does what it does. So I feel for all the parents this time of year where their little kids, are just like, but it's still dark and they're supposed to be up getting ready for school and things. When your body just knows it's like we're supposed to be sleeping and it doesn't want to. So I'm going to have to double down on my workout plan and get up and get out the door, but I'm going to have to probably use some tips and tricks and some tools to make it happen because not naturally going to be up because it's dark and cold. How about you, Jason? Anything you think about for self-care this week?
It just made me think that I almost have to wear sunglasses at night at the farm because I installed these gigantic spotlights on our new bin system. And so it is bright. It's
Oh,
almost too bright, I need to say,
wow.
but we really wanted to illuminate the areas where we're working at night. And, that's one thing when I'm out combining and doing work, this time of year always, it gets so dark. And so, we always kind of overcompensate with light. And so every year it seems like we upgrade our lights to something a little better, and that's kind of that false sense of creating my own sun, I guess, because I do like to have light as well.
That'd be a cool research project to see if light like that impacts like your sleep habits or stuff, because if you're bright enough, maybe it does. I don't know. So today we talked about cannabis and psychedelics and really talking about vaping and just the fact that we've moved from traditional smoking of products into this more commercialized e-cigarette situation and whether or not it's safer. And the jury's still out. We don't have all the research to say it's better. We're definitely targeting young people and children. The flavors that we talked about today definitely target young people, and we're just trying to make it taste better for more people to get involved so that they're hooked and addicted to a product for the rest of their lives. And so the data is pretty light on whether or not it's super safe. So if you're a person out there that's thinking about vaping or is vaping, you may need to think about it because there are some initial research showing that there's like popcorn lungs and other weird things that I don't know that I'd want. And I'm really concerned about how it impacts people. And then if you're folks listening and you're trying to figure out what to do with this at work, there's just a lot of gray area in this space. And so you've got to probably follow your smoking laws to get you started, but then watch for impairment like we talked about today. We've got tons of information in the show notes. Hopefully it'll help you out. We'll talk to you next time. Have a great day.